September 17th, 1946. 8,000 feet above the Atlantic, a Douglas DC-4 approaches the Newfoundland coast. Commercial air travel across the Atlantic is still in its infancy, and Belgium's national airline, Sabena, has been providing weekly service from Brussels to New York for only a month.
This was the 5th flight, I believe, of the Sabena Airlines, and they had 4 successful flights prior to this.
The trip is a long haul. Starting off from Brussels, the plane lands at Shannon Airport in Ireland for refueling, then makes the long trip across the Atlantic to refuel in Gander before taking the final leg to New York. Pilot Jean Esther is on his 2nd transatlantic flight since joining Sabena in March. Like his co-pilot Albert Dressard, Captain Esther's experience comes from flying combat missions during the war.
Immediately after the war, there were lots of pilots, and a lot of them with a lot of flight time, like Captain Esther here. It was really amazing. 26 years old, had been flying for about 10 years, and he had 4,000 hours.
Most of the 37 passengers are successful business people or come from well-to-do families, the only ones who can afford the high cost of air travel. Lily Rupert Leinertz has never flown before, and this flight is making her 68th birthday a memorable one. Raymond Liebert, a successful exporter of fine linen, is used to traveling, but usually by boat. His wife Renee has joined him on her 1st transatlantic flight.
Very early in 1946, my father had the opportunity to go to the States for a few days to an American plane, and my mother came along. It was really an adventure.
For Ruth Henderson, flying is a necessity she doesn't always enjoy. Her work with the International Girl Guides Association takes her all over the world, and air travel certainly saves time. John King, a 19-year-old student, sits across the aisle on the right side of the plane. Son of the Chinese ambassador to Belgium, John is on his way to study architecture in the United States.
As I remember, Dad was on the plane with Ruth Henderson, and Dad was an extrovert. He would talk with everybody. He was going off to college, so I'm sure that was part of their conversation. And so I'm sure they were chatting away.
Hostesses Jean Roux and Jean Bruylant have taken good care of their passengers during the long Atlantic haul, serving champagne and caviar despite bad weather.
In a modern jet, you're always flying above the weather. You know, when you fly along, you look down, you see the tops of the clouds. In the old days, flying in props, you're in that stuff all the time. So the only weather you're concerned with is the weather at the airport on arrival.
Bad weather is the focus of the flight crew's concern as they approach the coast of Newfoundland just after 4:40 a.m. Gander Airport is their next refueling stop before the last leg to New York. Captain Esther notes with approval that fuel consumption is normal and the aircraft's 4 engines are running perfectly. And Gander Airport, despite its isolated location, is one of the best equipped airports in the world.
It was just finished in 1939 when the war started. At that time, it was the biggest paved airport in the world. Every major airline in the world more or less had to come through Gander.
Gander was, I would say, one of the most important airports in the world. Gander was a huge communication station as well.
But it was built really out in the boonies. There was no access except by a railroad. It was surrounded by lakes and ponds. It was in a boggy area, but it was centrally located in the middle of the Atlantic for aircraft to fly to Europe. and it made this airport a very vital stopping point.
Pilot Jean Esther has landed in Gander once before, but skies had been bright and clear. This morning, a thick layer of cloud lies over the airport. Esther cannot see the ground below.
Pilot didn't know exactly with security where he was, because at that time they had no radar on board.
The cloud cover means that Captain Esther will have to make an instrument landing, using Gander's radio beacon to guide him. Usually, airplanes will fly in from the northeast over the radio beacon and circle down to the airport.
And this is what was expected, although there was no approved approach. It was kind of a convoluted situation at the time when the airlines had created their own approaches and the government had not established one.
The Gander radio beacon sends Morse code signals that indicate whether or not the aircraft is on course. When the aircraft flies directly over the transmitter, the signal cuts out.
And the only way you knew your position was to fly over the station. And when you flew over the station, you got no tone at all. And they call it the cone of silence.
Esther's flight chart depicts a back and forth movement over the beacon that not only gives the pilot a definite fix on his location, but allows time to descend gradually from 4,000 to 500 feet.
You had to do most of the approach to the east of Gander, on the east leg of the Gander radio range, and pass over the Gander radio range, descend, and you should break out cloud and do a circling approach close to the airport.
After a long Atlantic haul through bad weather, Captain Esther decides to bypass procedure on the approach. He will cross the beacon and turn into the southwest leg of the approach. Circling to 500 feet, he will then come in for a landing when he sees the runway. In the cabin, stewardess Jeanne Roux alerts passengers to fasten their seatbelts for landing. With a tailwind now gusting to 50 kilometers an hour, it's a rough ride, but the passengers have become used to it.
When they approached, visibility was very poor, and my father jokingly tied her safety belt as hard as he could.
It is 5:03 a.m. In order to descend to 500 feet in a shorter time, Esther crosses the transmitter at 2,000 feet instead of the customary 4,000. Co-pilot Albert Dressard alerts Gander Tower to their position and requests landing instructions. Air traffic control calls for a turn that will take them back toward the beacon and to the runway. Dressard reports that they are making the turn. Captain Esther sets his altimeter to indicate his height above the ground. In the cockpit, Esther and Dressard begin the turn that will land them safely. What they don't know is that the powerful northeast wind has pushed them 35 kilometers southwest, past Gander, where the ground elevation is higher. As the plane banks down through the clouds, the hills suddenly come into view. Dressard is the first to realize that they have gone wildly off course.
They believed that they were approaching Gander. At that last minute, the co-pilot, he was concerned about hills in the area. The last moment he decided to pull off, but it was too late then.
Stewardess Jeanne Roux is fastening her seatbelt when she hears a loud bang. Student John King hears the plane hit the trees.
You know, he had some premonition of trouble. So when they actually hit the first trees, he said he took his seatbelt off, which is totally counterintuitive to everything that everybody ever tells you. But he felt like he would be safer. He just said, well, I just thought it'd be better to take it off.
Now, the initial part, people would not have really known that they were crashing. It was just more turbulence. So from the time they realize it's maybe 3/4 of a second that it takes to really understand a situation is happening that's not normal, to the time that the plane stopped, there's a couple of seconds.
The DC-4 plows into the forest. Wings, propellers, and gas tanks break away. The momentum catapults Captain Jean Esther against the windshield. He dies, still strapped in. Albert Dressard is crushed in his seat. In the cabin, the tremendous impact causes the passengers to pitch forward.
The aircraft broke just after the cockpit, and some were trapped in their seats, folded up on the floor with the seats on top of them inside the aircraft.
47-year-old Ruth Henderson hears a terrific explosion and the sound of people screaming as 3 tons of fuel catch fire. Outside, 19-year-old John King, thrown clear of the wreck, manages to stand up and survey the scene. Hearing a call for help, King pulls stewardess Jean Roux away from the searing heat. Then he rushes to the burning plane to see if he can help anyone else. Inside, Ruth Henderson finally releases her seatbelt. She starts to crawl. A helping hand pulls her up. It is John King, and together they escape through a jagged hole in the fuselage as flames devour those passengers still inside. One of them is Lily Rupert Leinertz, who dies 68 years to the day that she was born.
Unfortunately, there were some that weren't projected out. They were still strapped in their seats and plane caught fire.
Ruth Henderson finds Renee Liebert face down in the bushes. She is badly injured, and her husband Raymond is nowhere in sight.
She hit partially part of a plane. There was a metal things who took off all the skin.
Renee Liebert calls for her husband Raymond, but he cannot be seen.
And my mother immediately realized, or very quickly realized, that he must be dead.
The survivors gather together in the wreckage. There is nothing they can do now but wait and hope. Wednesday, September 18th, 1946. A Belgian Sabena airplane has crashed south of Gander Airport. A small group of survivors battle to stay alive. Meanwhile, a seaplane patrols the skies over Gander, Newfoundland. It searches for the aircraft that has gone missing, but they are searching in the wrong area.
All the search effort was on the east leg of the radio range because everybody anticipated this being the normal approach for the aircraft.
The plane they are looking for has actually gone down in a wooded area southwest of Gander Airport. Of the 7 crew and 37 passengers, 25 survived the initial impact, but already several have died, including the flight engineer. Several others are in need of immediate medical care. Stewardess Jeanne Roux is doing her best to look after her passengers, despite her own serious injuries.
The flight attendant had a broken leg, and she thought she had to be in charge because she was the only crew person still surviving.
American passenger Ruth Henderson does what she can to make everyone as comfortable as possible.
He did a remarkable job of rallying up the passengers, and one of the first things they did was to go through all the luggage to get clothing, anything, because they were wet and cold.
By mid-morning, 6 aircraft from Argentia Naval Base and 3 civilian planes are in the air over Gander, under clearing skies. U.S. Air Force physician Captain Samuel Martin is aboard one of the Coast Guard seaplanes. Once the downed airliner is found, Captain Martin will lead a rescue team into the area to look for survivors. A commercial flight spots the wreck and alerts Gander Air Control, who in turn informs Sam Martin and his rescue crew. They drop supplies of food, sleeping bags, and bandages at the crash site.
He said they were so relieved to know that people knew where they were, and when the rescuers dropped supplies, then they really felt relieved that, okay, they're coming to get us, we're gonna be saved.
The site is not easily accessible, but the rescue team spots a small, uncharted lake 10 kilometers away, a possible landing place for a seaplane. 6 hours after leaving the lake, Sam Martin reaches the crash site.
Water soaked their radio, so they no longer had a radio. They also damaged their medical supplies, getting it all wet.
And there were some people, like my mother, the doctor knew that as soon as there would be some infection in it, it would be very quickly, she could stay there for very long.
For Sam Martin and the survivors of the crash, it will be the longest day of their lives. Friday, September 20th, 1946. The rescuers have set up a makeshift medical station to keep the survivors alive. The Coast Guard immediately sends word to its bases in New York and North Carolina to disassemble 2 of their experimental helicopters and send them by transport plane to Gander, along with the pilots to fly them. One of these men is Coast Guard Lieutenant Stu Graham.
Well, the first time I saw the crash site was on our approach to the field from Elizabeth City. We circled over the crash site, and all we could see was a burned-out remains of a fuselage.
By the end of the day, 8 of the most seriously injured survivors are airlifted to Gander, including Ruth Henderson, Renee Liebert, and John King.
He was taken to the hospital, but he said he had just fantastic care there, that everybody just, gave them all the care that they needed.
The following day, with both helicopters in operation, the remaining 10 survivors and their rescuers are evacuated safely. The press calls the whole operation a miracle. For the dead, it is another story. Only 6 of the dead are identifiable, and they are buried in separate graves. The rest are buried together, but individual crosses mark their place. Of the 44 people who crashed in the boggy woods of Newfoundland, 27 are dead. An inquiry concludes that the cause of the crash was the failure of the pilot to carry out a proper instrument approach in bad weather. It recommends that pilot training be standardized and that a standard instrument approach be devised for all international airports.
A year later, it was a different picture. They had radar here. They could see where an airplane was, and they could tell it to come. You could tell it, bring it right down on the runway.
For saving her life, Ruth Henderson presents a medal to John King on behalf of the Girl Guides Association.
And so she and Dad really bonded. I mean, he saved her life. The Girl Scouts had given him a medal as an honorary Girl Scout. And so this was one of Dad's stories was, yes, I'm an honorary Girl Scout.
Dr. Sam Martin goes on to become an eminent physician.
The doctor was able to keep these people alive for the 4 days that they were in the bush. And he discovered it was the cold temperatures that allowed these people to remain alive and keep the infections that they would normally get.
The crash site still exists to this day, and in 1996, a memorial was erected there to mark the 50th anniversary of the tragedy.
It's a huge monument, and it has one of the propellers mounted on the monument itself. But in the background, you can still see the remains of the burnt-out fuselage. The remains of the wings are still there. It's all there as it crashed.
The little cemetery is also there and bears the name given to it by the survivors to honor the man who saved their lives. It is known as St. Martin's in the Woods. For the survivors, the impact of the crash would leave a lasting mark. Ramo Leibert's body is never found. Renee's last memory of her husband is of him tightening her seatbelt.
That is the last thing she remembered from my father. Is that joke. He liked to joke, and he liked to make people laugh.
He always wanted to enjoy life, and I think seeing death so close up when you're so young, he always had a great joie de vivre. He always enjoyed himself, and he was always living in the present moment and, just being happy.